Hi guys, today we have the fun decade, okay, of the 60s. We have a decade where they were already building on what was already there, they just refined it. And the 60s were very important and very interesting years. Why? The designs are really perfected in many ways. From the proportions, from having really reliable movements that were developed, for example, by Rolex, from using a classic Valjoux 72 in many of those really higher quality watches, despite them being, quite affordable. And then you have the El Primero, you have the really cool divers from the time, and there's a mix of both, and that's what talks to me a lot. I do want to say as well that the 1960s were a bit of a decline in the classic watches. So I mean, anything that you'd wear with a suit, you'd have a lot of really classic Calatravas, but the designs were less out there. So you wouldn't have as many sector dials. You wouldn't have as many bold designs that would make watches look like a really different type of watch compared to other companies. Therefore, the 60s to me talk a lot in terms of sports watches, and especially Rolex has developed most of their designs that basically survived until the mid 2000s, and today I do have a lot to show you, so let's dive in. I do want to say thank you very much for the last video. A lot of people are tremendous to share about what they're liking. A lot of people contact me outside of YouTube as well, and I want to thank you very much. If you do like the video, please subscribe. I'm gonna repeat it at the end of the video, but it's something that I'm really enjoying, and I do want to share what I truly like. So we're gonna start with something that's really classic, and it's one of those watches that has transcended from the fact that Rolex never really did big watches back in the 60s. A lot of people asking me, hey, do we have bigger watches than 36 and the Rolex lineup? I tell them often no, because that was pretty much what was there in terms of Datejusts, in terms of classic type of watches. But if you do look a bit beyond that, what you're gonna see is that you're gonna have the Tudor Jumbos. Those were developed basically at the end of the 1960s. I have one here. This is a personal watch. It's really an insane condition. And every time I have them, they're selling quite fast. I have one with the blue purple dial right now on the website, but it's quite interesting. And what happens most of the time is that people, they're gonna see this and they're gonna be like, oh, it's a Tudor, oh, it's not a Rolex movement, oh, it's the baby company of Rolex. I'm like, no, you know what, even though it uses an ETA movement, or I think an ESA or ESA movement, I think the 1800, they're really good. They're not gonna break. They're really sturdy, and the looks are fabulous. The only other choice you have back in the time, and that mostly appeared back in the 1970s, they're a lot more common in the 70s, is basically the same case. You have a 1019 by Rolex, which is the Milgauss. It's the same size, it's the same case. But this you can get for way under $5,000 Canadian, which is relatively close to the $3,500 US if you have a near perfect one. If you have something that's cheaper, it's gonna have no box, no bracelet, you're gonna have one for roughly 3,500 Canadian, more or less. And you have something bigger, you have something that's way different than a Datejust. You have something that is basically an affordable type of Rolex, because it was meant to be a Rolex movement in there, and it's just as solid as anything else. Also, the dial is tremendously big for the time. That's what a lot of people tell me. Hey, that watch doesn't look that size. And yeah, they don't, because a lot of the watches from Rolex or even Tudor were about 27 to 28 millimeters. So the case is much bigger than what is encased into the case itself, which is the dial, and that's what we see. The fact that the dials are quite small makes the watch look smaller. And most of the watches, including if you're looking at a sub, you're looking at anything else, it's the same size dial as a Datejust. Yet they're bigger cases, but the dials themselves, they remain the same. Therefore, I think that this is a tremendous piece. If you have the chance to buy one, or you want to have something that's way different, again, we're talking of how cool it is to have something that doesn't belong in the normality of the market, okay? Of something that you can buy and have and own that's different from everyone else. I think those two doors are one of my love and personal big heart towards them. The next thing that also is very important, might it be Rolex, might it be Wittnauer, might it be Longines, and everyone else almost had the Valjoux 72 in their watches, including small companies that you'll never even hear about them. They were using Valjoux 72 movements, which was used also in the famous Daytonas or pre-Daytonas from the 1960s. If you're looking at the 6238, 6239, 6240, 41, and so on, or 6263 from Rolex, because they started with the 6263, I believe, in 1969 or 1970, they are tremendous watches to own, and they were all using the same movement. So Rolex didn't create anything special. They finalized the movement by finishing it better, but they didn't make anything that impressive in terms of design, okay? Of the movement, yes, a bit, but it's not like they reinvented the movements a bit like Patek was refinishing the whole Lemania movements themselves. Therefore, you have quality movements, very sturdy. They just need a service most of the time. If you do need parts, Valjoux 72 movements are pretty much available everywhere. They begin to be a bit costly, but it's worth it. And not only that, they're interchangeable. So if you're looking at the 22, 23, the Valjoux 72, or any other variant of the calendar type, a lot of the parts are interchangeable. So you might find a watch that's destroyed, but the movement might be really good to use donor parts from it into repairing your watch. That's what's cool about the 60s. I find that they were all trending towards that usability of those watches. And despite now saying, oh, well, everyone is using an ETA movement or a Sellita or everything else, I find in the 60s at least they were trying to do something a bit different, despite the fact that the proportions were pretty similar. We do have very individual designs by every single company. If you're looking at Zodiac, if you're looking at Universal Geneva as well, they were all using the Valjoux 72. Some of them did decide to change the name of the movement, even though it's clearly a Valjoux 72. And then you have Rolex again that has modified and called them Valjoux 72B, 72 727, and so on and so forth. And they made so many different variants of the same movement with little tweaks. They had their own recipe too, but the base was pretty much identical to everyone else. What's cool as well is that you're gonna see, for example, I have here a Favre-Leuba. I was lucky enough to find it at a dealer, I believe might have been 8 or 9 years ago, and I bought it for myself. It was quite, let's say, affordable back then, and now obviously a lot of people have caught on in the quality of the Sea Sky model, and there is a lot of respect for this watch from people that actually know what it really is. It's not something that, again, I'm selling. It's something that I appreciate. They're also made with the Valjoux 71, which is a rare version of the 3-register chronographs. They also made some with radium dial. This one is not. That's the second iteration. So most probably it's the early 60s, 1963, 64, something in that region. What's cool about this one, it's pretty much untouched. It does have an NSA bracelet as well, which has the logo of Favre-Leuba. Very cool watch, very much appreciated by collectors and by people who are in this industry. From my point of view, it's one of the coolest chronographs that I've seen, and it competes very much with the looks of a Daytona 6263 and bigger, with a different type of dial. There's lacquer on that. There's the fact that the dial is also gilt, and so on and so forth. So you have a mix of older technology with newer types of looks, but it does look a bit more like a 50s watch than a 60s watch itself, which is truly amazing to see the transitions and designs throughout that decade. The next one, let's get away a bit from the Valjoux 72. I'm going to go back to that in a bit. But then you still have the Speedmasters. The Speedmasters have evolved tremendously back in the 60s. You have obviously the 2915, the 2998, which transcends again into the 60s with the dash 3, dash 4, and so on and so forth. And then you have the 105002 1962, which is a transitional model from the 2998 into the Ed White, which is the .003 or dash 003. And this one has the alpha hands, which are really rare for this model. It does look from far like a 2998-6. So it is very, very close to that. If you put them side by side, there's no difference, okay? It's only the reference in the back that changes everything, and that makes the watch extremely rare in terms of how they put it together, and it's one of the early ones. A lot of them don't have the alpha hands, and that's what makes it very, very, very valuable in terms of collectability and obviously the value associated to the watch. Speedmasters as well have had different variants, from pressed pushers to screw pushers to different bezels. A lot of people know about the dot over 90 bezels, but then there's other intermediate differences. Then you have one watch that's super cool. You have the Ultraman, which is from 1967. They made only, I believe, 50 of those. And what's cool about the Speedmaster is that, again, if you know and you dig in, you're gonna see that there's so many things to learn and so many things to collect. If you're really a NASA fan and you're really a fan of history, I think that the Speedmasters from the 60s are the ones that are the most important, because of obviously their relation with NASA, their relation with the fact that they were really out there for people to use on a daily basis. Very few of them resisted the urge to actually polish them, the urge to actually replace parts as soon as they had a little, let's say, defect, let's say on especially anything visual. The movement, not so damaging to actually replace a few parts, but if you want something correct, you have to do your research about those. There's Speedmaster 101 that describes every single reference, and there might be a bit of discrepancy between different years. You might find something that's, again, transitional. The serial number doesn't quite match. It happened to me in the past. Obviously, if you see that the movement is from the 1970s and you have a mid-60s watch, obviously it doesn't fit within the range. But pretty much what Speedmaster 101 has on the website will give you a very good idea of what you own, and most probably he can also help you with the value. I know he also sells some watches on the side as well. He does have a lot of following and a huge community of people who like Speedmasters. Let's go into something that's super classic and that really, for me, screams the 1960s. And this is the Tudor that I have right here. This one is a tuxedo. So most people know them under the reference 7995-0. They're 34 millimeters. They do have a really strong peripheric side ring around the dial, and they're really clean. I find it, even in certain ways, just as good looking, if not even better, than the Gerald Genta pull router or pull-out router from the time, and I find them so well built. The thing with those is that they're a bit more resistant to humidity because of the crown and the screwback case, and they're really, really well kept. And most of the ones I've had, I think I've had maybe 10-15 of them. I stopped counting by now, but I've had a lot of those, and they're always good, and they're aging very well. I think that a lot of people are just discrediting them compared to the UG models because they just don't know about them. And when they see them, it's a kind of a love and hate relationship for a lot of people, because it's not marked UG, yet they do look very much alike. Big difference, obviously, you don't have the hairline cross that basically separates the 4 quadrants of the dial like the UG does. But in most cases, it's still looking pretty clean. And then a lot of them, if not most of them, have the silver writing. Then you have different variants from the caliber 390, which is the older caliber that Tudor used, and then this is an ETA movement that they're using. Very cool watch, screams the 1960s. If I could say, it does scream gentleman-esque, if you want to call it this way. You can wear it casually and you can wear it at work as well. It's not gonna give any bad vibes, and people are always gonna enjoy you having this on the wrist if you do like those. If we're jumping into classic watches, as I said, for a lot of people, the 1960s screams more classic divers, classic sports watches, classic chronographs. But then when you look at what IWC was doing, that's a caliber, I believe 852 or 853, what I have here. Very cool caliber. Same as the Ingenieur calibers back in the time. Very, very well built. The case is magnificent. The finishing on the dial is gorgeous. And then you have the famous little fish on the side for IWC when you're looking at the crown. But it's a bit bland, you know. If you're really looking for something classic, I much prefer the 1940s and the 1950s. I'm not saying this is a bad watch. It's almost too clinical. It's almost too perfect for what it is. And I do agree that today people are aspiring to that kind of look. A lot of companies, they make bigger watches and they have that very clinical, very perfect look, and I think that this is what this does, but it's a bit ahead of its time despite it being smaller. So yes, it's a vintage watch, but it doesn't quite hit me as much as the 1940s, you know. So for me, I have a strong preference for those really bold looking 1940s, 1950s watches, and they were trying to do something else. Yet in the 1960s, they dialed down on the design and they went more in the perfectionism of how to make a watch look a bit like a classic Calatrava. A lot of the Pateks, if you put them side by side, you just hide the company name, they're gonna look pretty much the same as the IWC. And I do have a lot of respect for that, but it's not a watch that speaks to me as much as other companies would have done maybe 10 or 15 years back. I'm a big fan of classic watches, but I find that everyone was trying to do a bit the same thing, despite the fact that the movements were fabulous. You have Zenith, you have like most classic ones, obviously Omega. Omega was doing a bit different, so you're gonna have a lot of very nice constellations back in the 60s, but I find that everything else was a bit too much alike, and then it's only a preference of the brand at that point, of the fact that you're gonna buy something that's really good, but it's basically what your preference is gonna be. A lot of those watches are 14 or 18 karat. There's no bad choices in terms of gold, so they're really, really fabulous. And I'd say even a stainless steel model is almost, if not just as desirable as something that was made in gold back then. Everyone has heard of the El Primero, and everyone talks to me about the Daytona El Primero. Everyone, as soon as I say, hey, you know what do you think about vintage Daytonas or whatnot, everyone's like, oh, the El Primero ones. They have no clue of what we're talking about, because a lot of times they're just pointing at the fact that the El Primero is their vintage movement. Everyone knows about the Zenith El Primero. Obviously, it's something that everyone has been waiting for back in the time, because it was the first time that companies were developing an automatic chronograph. Zenith announced it first. I don't think they came out with it first, but they announced it a bit before everyone else. I do know that Seiko was, I believe, in May of 69, and basically the Buren, Hoyer, Breitling, and Dubois des Pras Association did announce it, I think, in March. I don't know which one really came first, but Zenith was really the first one to announce it. Again, there was always that debate of who was first, who was better, who was this and that. It's not so important. But what's important is that the Zenith was by far the most developed movement in every single way. They do have more parts, they're fully integrated, and you have basically a fully developed movement by one company. When you're looking at Seiko, even though the 6139, I think it's one of the best, most reliable movements out there in terms of it working for a very long time. I don't think it's just as refined as what Zenith does, not even close. And then you have the Buren, Hoyer, Dubois des Pras, and Breitling Association, which basically took 4 companies to develop one movement, which was a module on something that was already made by Buren themselves. This is a good movement, but again, it's not a fully integrated movement from top to bottom. It's not interconnected, as you would say. So from a technical point of view, Zenith was just amazing and properly finished. I find that it's one of the best movements out there, but it's not because they were used in the Daytonas, it's because they're simply really good. They're working like workhorses themselves, and they're high beat, defining as well a very high precision. Every time I had one, they're working just perfectly. The one that I have here, just to showcase one of them, I have here a CoverGirl, that A3818. This one happens to be new old stock, or let's put it this way, very lightly worn if it was ever really worn. It still has plastics on the sides. Condition is just fabulous. The loom is impeccable. The case back is untouched. You can clearly see that there's no wear on the case back itself, and the watch is just looking perfect. I find that the new one is replicating the model very well, but not quite as perfect as the vintage iteration. I find them just amazing and perfectly looking at 37 millimeters. They're properly integrated. The dials are very well made. A lot of them sadly have been, let's say, oxidized, because what happens with the blue finishes on dials is that as soon as the lacquer starts lifting, air slides under, the blue is lost, and what happens then, you have a dial that kind of looks gold and blue, and mostly it's patchy, which is not as visually attracting. But I'd say anything from the El Primero line is just fabulous, and I find that, again, the 1960s developments on watches were just amazing, and everyone still talks about it even today. Let's go back to Rolex. I know a lot of people are gonna tell me, oh, Rolex, stop it, whatever, blah blah blah. It's you know, I know it's always the same companies that are taking the first cover, or whatever you want to say. Rolex, basically whatever they learned in the 50s, they brought in the 60s, and they basically elevated themselves to a functional working company in many ways. Obviously, they were always very, very present in the newspapers, in publicities, in movies, and they are not kings of watches, they're basically kings of publicity, and that's why everyone wants a Rolex. Everyone knows the name Rolex, and everyone that ever hears, hey, you own a Rolex, you've made it, you know? So it's basically very much what they're good at. But not only that, they managed to use the same type of movements, or a variant or slight different movements from a watch to another, and then just market them as different models, okay? From GMTs to Explorers to Submariners to Datjusts. Basically, you have a couple of little parts, or a little tweak on the balance wheel, or a couple of movement details that make it different. That's what they're really good at, and they're still doing it today. And I think that this is a very good publicity stunt in many, many, many different ways. So if we're looking at differences between a Datejust and an Explorer, the Explorer has no date. The Datejust has a date, but the difference is basically just the date module, okay? So it's the date wheel with a ring that holds the date in place, and then the little parts that allow the date to change every 24 hours, which is a specific wheel that does only that. There's no difference, okay? If you're looking at the cases, yeah, the case of the Explorer is a bit thicker. The bezel is different from a Datejust because it does belong to this one only. Even the crystal is a bit different, but in general, it's almost the same. You could find also the same bracelets on Datejusts as well. So if I'm taking a 7206 bracelet that I have here, and you're interchanging it on the Datejust, most probably only difference is going to be the end links, or it's still going to fit. Therefore, Rolex was really good at doing that, and they perfected that back in the 60s. Today, everyone's dreaming about different dials, different colors of bezels, or GMT or sub. Believe me, it's all the same watches, okay? Even case backs are interchangeable between those two watches. A lot of people were like, for real? I'm like, yeah, I have right now a 16570 case, and I've put all parts from a GMT at 16710, and they're all interchangeable. It's the same parts. The case is identical. Therefore, yeah, a lot of people will say, hey, you're making a Frankenstein. Yeah, it's for me. I'm not selling it. I'm acknowledging that I did this for myself. But in many cases, you have Rolex that did very similar things. You know, they interfit each other, but they're doing it so well. They perfected that in many ways, and they're still doing it today. You're gonna see it as well, many cases or many case backs that are the same for sports watches. They just, especially today, you're gonna see the same reference number of the case back on the case back itself. 2360, 2380, whatever the reference numbers on those case backs are. There's no serial number on them, so they're easily interchangeable if the case permits. What makes a huge difference in Rolex is all those little details. If you're looking from a 5512, 5513, chapter rings, gilt dials, pointed crown guards, square crown guards, which are almost unobtainium, they're super, super rare. If you're looking at Datejusts with different stone dials, different colors, whatever, that's what makes the world of Rolex very interesting. And back in the 60s, they were able to market that very, very, very well. And if we're looking here at a point and crown guard 5512, I have this one on the website, and I have here a 5513 with zinc sulfide dial. So what does that mean? It means that the lume is normally a bit greenier or a bit greener, and it still looms even today. The big difference between the two of them, obviously the dial, because we're in the gilt era and here we're in the matte dial era, and a lot of people look at this insert and they're like, hey, is it blue? Did it come like this? I'm like, no. A lot of people think that Rolex was doing a blue insert back then, which is not the case. They can turn gray, green, blue, not fade, fade. There are so many different shades of inserts, and that's why a lot of people, including myself, are collecting inserts. Same thing here. This insert is almost impeccable. It's almost perfect, and yet the watch is dating from 1962. So the difference is there. Some of them aged, some of them didn't, and depends who wore them, how they wore them, and so on and so forth. The major difference in many of those watches has to do with little details, and that's what makes them extremely valuable or desirable. Again, I'm not here to talk about Rolex, but I'm just saying how much innovation there was in the 60s, and that's why I appreciate the companies doing that so well back then. I had a comment maybe 3 months ago or 4 months ago. If you're watching, you're gonna know who you are, and basically the person was accusing me of not owning Wittnauers and Elegance and Hamiltons or whatever. I do sell them, but it's not a big market, and I'm not going to collect whatever people think I need to collect to impress them or to stand by what I'm actually selling. I collect what I like, and people do collect what they want to collect as well, and I'm not forcing anyone to buy anything from me. But here are two Wittnauers. We're talking about Valjoux 72. It's not that I don't like Wittnauers myself. I do collect Valjoux 72 watches personally. But in many cases, I'm a fan of a different design or different watches in themselves. And don't forget, I'm a dealer. I can't collect everything. I'd like to keep a lot of watches. It's not possible. I have to go with the means of someone who also has a life. I cannot just put all my money into watches. I cannot be an addict to my drug all the way. I can be a bit, but not to an extent that I'm going to put all my money into it. Otherwise, there's no more business. I'm just going to be a collector with no money, basically. But all that said, those watches are tremendous. They're both using a variant of the Valjoux 72 movement. This is the 726, I believe, and Wittnauer GMT. So basically, you have a very similar look to a Heuer GMT from the time, but it's actually a Wittnauer. Really rare watch. Then you have the professional 72 here, which is a very classic watch, all black dial, very, very unique to the company itself. Therefore, you do see a bit of a mix of looks because everyone was trying to basically make it their own. Wittnauer here is using a normal, it's basically kind of orange, burnt orange GMT hand. It's really different from Heuer. It's really different from including Rolex that was using not the chronograph function, but basically a GMT function themselves. The looks are different. You can recognize them as soon as you see them. Even from afar, you're gonna see, hey, that's a rare watch. And you're gonna recognize the brand and the model for what it is. And Wittnauer has done amazing things because being tied up with Longines and being tied up with the fact that they were importing Longines as well, you're going to see a very, very similar watch within the Longines lineup. I've had it before. Really cool cool design, and there's nothing to envy from one company or another. It's going to be based on what you really prefer personally. I'm going to cut down to the chase and say that I really enjoy the 60s for many reasons. For the fact that a lot of companies are trying to remake them today. Doesn't mean that they're not trying to make 1950s or 1940s designs or even earlier, but I'd say anything from that era is very, very recognizable, including by people who don't know about watches that much. A sub from the 60s is going to be easily recognizable. A sub from the 50s, not as much. The proportions are a bit different, and they were just way different in terms of design, in terms of case, in terms of bezels, and despite them being really, really amazing, I find that the 60s are incarnating the companies a bit better. They're really screaming classic functional watches, and their identity was very clear. A lot of companies found their identity back then and they really stood by it, and despite this being a really bad decade for a lot of watchmaking companies or a lot of watchmakers themselves, I find that the 60s were prime time for a lot of companies. I think this is what I prefer the most personally. Obviously, there's a lot of companies that deserve mentions, including Hoyer, including Universal Genève, including, I'd say, something that really is very, very important for me, more of Zenith, not the ones I showed today, but other models that they made that are quite unique that I haven't seen personally. What I think is that the 60s really speak to me in many ways, and the more you know about what was made back then, the more you're going to respect it and the more you're going to appreciate it as well. If you do have anything to share, to talk about, we can discuss on YouTube, or you can message me directly through my email. You're going to find it on the website, through the phone. If you want to WhatsApp me or you want to send me a message, I'm pretty responsive. And hope you like the video. I wish you a very good week. Thank you very much.